Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we're doing something a little different. We're not just looking at one book or, even a set of books in isolation. We're looking at a specific way of seeing the world.
It's more of a pattern recognition exercise.
Exactly.
And to do that, we are diving deep into the work of the late Christopher Hitchens. I mean, we have a whole stack of material here, specifically his memoir, Hitch 22, The Polemic God is Not Great.
And the essay collections, Long Live Hitch, and parts of Arguably.
Right. But, and this is probably the most important thing to say up front, this is not a biography of Christopher Hitchens.
No. And it's definitely not a debate about whether God exists. If you're here for a theological argument or, some gossip about literary London in the 70s, this probably isn't the deep dive for you.
Right. We're asking a much more structural question today. The central inquiry, the thing we really want to get at, is this. How do systems of absolute authority, and it doesn't matter if they're theological or political or even linguistic, how do they manufacture consent and actually shape human perception?
It's really about a conflict between two opposing forces. On one side, you have what Hitchens himself called the totalitarian principle.
Which is what, exactly?
It's the demand for the total surrender of your private self, the demand for absolute, unwavering certainty.
Then on the other side,
the ironic mind, which is, the capacity for doubt, for complexity, for being able to live without that safety net of certainty.
So what we're going to do is try to map the actual structures of these dogmatic systems. We want to look at the mechanics, the nuts and bolts of how certainty gets weaponized to control people's behavior.
And how language itself, just the words we use, is deployed to enforce what you could call thought crimes.
And a quick disclaimer before we really jump in. As always, this is an analysis of the source material. We're mapping the system as the author describes it.
We're not telling you how you should live your life. We're just offering a lens, a way to maybe see the structures of power around you a little bit differently.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We probably have to start with the man himself, but, only as it relates to these arguments.
Of course.
Hitchens is often painted as this contrarian, right? Someone who just jumped political ships. The standard narrative you always hear is that he went from being this socialist firebrand, a Trotskyist, even in his youth, to then supporting the Iraq War and sort of aligning with the neoconservatives later in his life. People just call it a flip-flop.
Yeah, that's the easy surface-level take.
It really is. But if you dig into the source material, especially the essays in Arguably and Long Live Hitch, Hitchens argues vehemently that there was no jump.
So what was it then? How did he see it? He defines his entire intellectual life by a very specific internal conflict that was happening within the left. He makes this distinction between what he calls the anti-imperialist left and the anti-totalitarian left.
And this is a really key distinction because it basically explains the entire lens he uses to view the world from that point on.
Absolutely. For him, it's not about left versus right. It's about the fundamental nature of the power that you're opposing.
So let's break that down. The anti-imperialist side, what does that look like according to him?
Well, the anti-imperialist left, in his view, is the group that defines itself pretty much solely by its opposition to Western power, which usually just means the United States.
It's a binary system.
A very simple one. If the West is the global colossus, the big bad guy, then literally anyone fighting the West is, by default, an ally, or at the very least, a necessary evil you have to tolerate.
It's that classic, the enemy of my enemy is my friend logic.
Precisely. And the systemic flaw there, which Hitchens points out again and again, you see it in his essays on the Balkans, on the Middle East, is that this stance often leads to making excuses for local dictators, for theocratic fascists.
So you'd see people on the left defending groups like Hamas or Hezbollah.
Or the Serbian militias under Milosevic, simply because they were also fighting the empire. It forces you into some really morally compromised positions.
Because it's a purely reactionary stance. It's only defined by what it's against, not what it's actually for.
Whereas Hitchens aligns himself with the anti-totalitarian left. For him, the primary enemy isn't a specific country or a geography or even an economic system like capitalism.
The enemy is the principle itself.
Yes, the enemy is the existence of absolute unaccountable power wherever it crops up. He argues that you can't, in good conscience, support a theocracy or a dictatorship just because it happens to be anti-American at the moment.
And that really does set the stage for our entire conversation today. The lens we're using, taken from the source, is that power is power.
It doesn't matter if that power is wearing a clerical robe, a military uniform, or a business suit. If it demands your total submission, it is the enemy of the free mind.
Which brings us to the role of the person who's supposed to be observing all this power. I love that anecdote in Arguably where he talks about his old schoolmaster.
Oh yeah, the teacher who kind of sneers at him.
He does. He says something like, wouldn't you say, Hitchens, that his writing was somewhat journalistic?
As if it's the ultimate insult you can hurl in academia. Journalistic.
Yeah.
It means cheap, disposable, not serious.
Lacking in theory. But Hitchens takes that word and completely reclaims it.
He does, because he looks at the actual lineage of people who are journalists. You've got Emile Zola during the Dreyfus Affair,
Charles Dickens exposing the workhouses.
Thomas Paine sparking revolutions, George Orwell in Catalonia. I mean, the list goes on.
These were just people filing, weather updates. They were combatants in an intellectual war.
No, not at all. In this systemic framework he's building, the journalist plays a very specific role. They are the source of institutional friction.
Institutional friction. I like that. What does it mean?
It means the journalist's job is to disrupt the clean, sanitized history that the victors and the authorities are always trying to write for themselves, to throw a wrench in the works.
He even reclaims the word hack, which is great. He basically says that mere writing, deadline writing, can aspire to art if it just tells the truth about power. He loved the grind of it.
Because the hack is on the ground. The hack is looking at the system from street level, not from some ivory tower. And that idea, that tension, leads us directly to the title of his memoir, Hitch 22.
Which is, of course, a play on Joseph Heller's Catch-22.
An ultimate novel about bureaucratic insanity, about the inescapable double binds that authority puts you in.
So what's the Hitch 22? What's his version of that paradox?
The Hitch 22 paradox is the central tension of his entire life and work. It's this. You have to have unalterable convictions. You have to be willing to fight against totalitarianism, to stand up and say, this is wrong, and I will try to stop it.
So you need certainty to act.
Yes.
Yeah.
But at the exact same time, you have to maintain constant skepticism and constant doubt, precisely to avoid becoming a totalitarian yourself.
That is a dialectical tightrope walk. I mean, that sounds almost impossible.
It's incredibly difficult. You have to be sure enough to fight, but unsure enough to listen. Most people, he would argue, fall off one side or the other.
They become fanatics who are absolutely certain they're right.
Or they become cynics who doubt everything and therefore do nothing at all.
And that dialectic, that tension is really what we're going to explore. How do you maintain that sort of crisis in perception that lets you see the world clearly, but without falling into the trap of absolute certainty?
That's the question. So let's move into the core systems analysis.
Okay, let's get into it. God is Not Great. This book was, a massive bestseller. It's often lumped in with Dawkins and Harris as part of the new atheist movement. But we want to look at the structural argument Hitchens is making.
Right. And he argues that religion is not just a belief system, but the original form of totalitarianism.
And to make that point, he explicitly compares the structure of monotheistic religion to the political structure of North Korea.
Yes. Which is, a very jarring comparison for a lot of people. It can sound like pure hyperbole.
So how does he justify that? Not as an insult, but structurally.
Well, he says you just have to look at the design of the system. In North Korea, what do you have? You have a leader who is infallible. You cannot question him. His word is law.
Okay, so that's one-to-one, the dear leader, God.
Then you have this subject population that is, in Hitchens' absolutely devastating phrase, created sick and commanded to be well.
Let's pause on that for a second, because that phrase explains the entire incentive structure, doesn't it? Created sick and commanded to be well.
It's the core mechanism of control. The system itself creates a problem. Original sin, impurity, human frailty, whatever you want to call it, that only the system has the cure for.
So you were born into debt. You were born needing redemption from the very people who told you were broken in the first place.
You're broken by default. And in North Korea, it's the same principle. You have to thank the dear leader for your food, for the sunrise, for the simple fact that you haven't been shot today. It's a closed loop of dependency.
But he takes the comparison even further to a place that's actually kind of terrifying.
He does. Because the most terrifying part of the comparison is that in a political dictatorship like North Korea, you can at least die. Death is an escape from the surveillance of the state.
The Kim dynasty can't read your mind, and they can't follow you into the grave.
Right. But in what Hitchens calls the celestial dictatorship, there is no escape, not even in death.
It's a celestial North Korea. The surveillance is eternal.
Exactly. He calls it a celestial super surveillance. It's the ultimate panopticon. You have no privacy, not even inside your own skull, and it lasts forever.
And the outcome of a system like that is a population living in a state of permanent fear and, weirdly, permanent gratitude.
Gratitude for mercy. But as the source material argues, this mercy is actually just the suspension of an arbitrary punishment that the system invented.
It's a protection racket. Nice soul you've got there. Be ashamed if something happened to it.
That's it, precisely.
Yeah.
The deity creates the hell, and then graciously offers you the only ladder out of it. But the price of the ladder is your complete and total submission.
It's a brilliant, if, utterly terrifying system design. But Hitchens doesn't just look at this on the cosmic grand scale. He brings it right down to the micro level in Hitch 22, using his own childhood at a British boarding school.
And some of those stories are just harrowing. It's easy for people to dismiss them as just, oh, that's tough British schooling, but Hitchens sees the seeds of totalitarianism right there.
He calls it micromegalomania.
Micromegalomania.
What does that mean exactly?
It's the exercise of arbitrary, unaccountable power, but in a very small sphere. The key insight here, though, is about the nature of the rules. We tend to think of dictatorships as these rigid, hyper-organized, rule-bound places, like a well-oiled machine.
But Hitchens argues that the true essence of dictatorship isn't regularity.
It's caprice. It's unpredictability.
He mentions that rule of thumb they had at his school. Whatever is not compulsory is forbidden.
Which is such a mind-bending rule. It means the default state of every subject is guilty or at risk. You can never be sure you're safe.
Because you might be breaking a rule you don't even know exists.
Right. And that induces a state of constant self-surveillance. You don't need a guard in every room if you can make the prisoners police their own thoughts, because they're terrified of breaking some unwritten, unknowable rule.
And there's that one specific, perfect anecdote about face crime. Can you recount that one?
Oh, yes. A master just screams at him out of the blue, "Hitchens, take that look off your face."
And he had no idea what his face was doing.
He was terrified. He's trying to figure out what look he could possibly have. He didn't even realize his face was an actor in this drama.
That is pure Orwell. That's straight out of 1984.
It absolutely is, because what it does is it trains the subject to police their own thoughts before they can even manifest as actions or words. If you can get in trouble for the look on your face, an involuntary expression, then you are never safe.
You are always transparent to authority. And this becomes the training ground for how to live under a theocracy or a fascist state. You learn to hide your inner self just to survive.
And this connects directly to the next part of the system's architecture, the moral trap, which is the idea of creating laws that are literally impossible to obey.
This is a really critical piece of the control puzzle.
It's huge. If you want to really control a population, you don't just make laws against murder or theft, things that, most reasonable people don't want to do anyway. That doesn't create dependency.
So what do you do?
To create dependency, you have to make laws against natural, unavoidable human impulses.
Like sex.
Specifically sex. Hitchens argues that the obsession you see in these systems, with sexual prohibition laws against sodomy, bans on masturbation, the constant policing of women's bodies, it isn't really about morality in the way we think of it.
It's a control mechanism.
It's a pure control mechanism.
Because sexual thoughts, sexual urges, they're biological. They're inevitable for most people.
Exactly. And if your law forbids a thought or an urge that is biologically hardwired into the species, then congratulations.
Yeah.
Every single one of your citizens is automatically a criminal. You have created a system where innocence is impossible from the start.
You've just manufactured universal guilt.
And a guilty population is a manageable population.
Right.
They're always seeking absolution. They're always coming to the ruling caste, the priests, the party leaders, and begging for forgiveness.
It guarantees the authorities a monopoly on one of the strongest human drives.
It's ingenious in a really dark way.
Yeah.
If I can make you feel guilty just for being human, I own you.
And to maintain that ownership, that control, you have to control the language. Which brings us to the system of euphemism and taboo.
Yes. Hitchens was, obsessed with the precise use of language. He hated euphemisms with a passion. He called them the language of the slave.
Why? What's so dangerous about a euphemism?
Because euphemisms are designed to soften or obscure reality, specifically to protect the system. He talks about this at length in Long Live Hitch, especially regarding the Danish cartoons incident.
Right, let's just set the context for that. This was back in 2005. A Danish newspaper published a series of cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad, and it sparked these violent riots across the world.
Embassies were burned down, people were killed. It was a major global event.
And what was the response from the systems of the West, the politicians, the church leaders, the mainstream press?
Overwhelmingly, they didn't rush to defend the principle of free speech. They called for respect.
Respect sounds nice. I mean, who doesn't want respect? It's a positive word.
It is. But Hitchens argues that in this specific context, respect was a code word. It was a euphemism
For what?
for fear. The system was demanding that we respect the violence of the mob. It was a demand for submission, cleverly disguised as politeness and cultural sensitivity.
So it creates a crisis in perception. We're being told we're seeing a call for dignity, but what we're actually seeing is a threat of violence if we don't comply.
Hitchens was absolutely furious about this. His line was something like, "I am not going to respect your belief that I should be killed for drawing a picture." By forcing us to use the word respect, the system forces us to lie to ourselves about the nature of the threat.
It makes us internalize the sense, or we do it to ourselves.
Preemptive surrender. And this extends from public speech right down to the sacred texts themselves. There's a fascinating and actually slightly hilarious anecdote about white raisins in God is not great.
Oh, this is the Christoph Luxemburg theory. It's such a great example of what happens when you have a system built on textual rigidity, when you're not allowed to edit the script.
It really is.
So walk us through it. What's the theory?
Hitchens cites this German scholar, Luxemburg, who's an expert in ancient Semitic languages. And Luxemburg argues that the Quran, as we had it, draws heavily on older Aramaic and Syriac Christian texts.
Okay, so there's a linguistic history there.
A deep one. And he suggests that the famous promise of 72 virgins in paradise for martyrs is actually a simple mistranslation. The word her, which is usually translated as virgins in its original Aramaic usage, likely referred to white raisins.
White raisins.
White raisins, which at the time were a rare and expensive delicacy, a symbol of luxury.
So you blow yourself up and you get a handful of dried fruit.
It's just darkly comic, isn't it? But the systemic point here isn't really about whether it's virgins or raisins. The point is the response to that kind of scholarly inquiry.
Right. Systems of absolute authority cannot tolerate textual criticism.
They can't, because if you can question the word, you can question the authority that's based on that word.
If it's just a translation error, then the Holy Book is a human document. And if it's a human document, it can be flawed.
And if it can be flawed, the entire basis for the authority of the clerisy crumbles. This is why the madrasa's system of education, as Hitchens describes it, relies so heavily on rote memorization.
You just repeat the sounds. You don't analyze the meaning.
Because analysis is friction. It's a challenge. Memorization is lubrication for the system. It keeps things running smoothly.
So let's try to map this out explicitly. We've talked about these different concepts, but who are the actual players? If we're looking at this as a system map, who are the key actors?
Okay, so first you have the clerisy, or the caste. These are the people who claim to have celestial decoding privileges. They hold the keys to the kingdom.
They're the ones who tell you what the Holy Book really means, or what the party chairman actually intended with his proclamation. They are the gatekeepers of truth.
And the dispensers of absolution. Then, on the ground level, you have the micromegalomaniacs.
Right. The schoolmasters from his childhood, the petty bureaucrats, the Chekists in a police state.
The people who get a genuine thrill from the exercise of arbitrary power in their own small spheres. The people who just love to say no. They are the enforcers.
And then you have the systems anomaly, the dissident or the journalist.
Yes. The glitch in the matrix, the Orwell, the Payne, the Hitchens. The person who insists, often at great personal risk, on calling things by their right names.
Their function is to break the spell of the euphemism, to point out that the emperor has no clothes.
Exactly. They reintroduce friction into a system that wants to be frictionless.
And what about the feedback loops? How does a system like this sustain itself over time?
Well, there's a big one he identifies, the credulity loop. It starts with maintaining ignorance. You ban books, you discourage outside questions, you punish curiosity.
And that leads to what he calls innocent credulity.
People just don't know any better because they've never been exposed to a compelling counterargument. Their intellectual immune system is weak.
And that credulous population then falls prey to unscrupulous leaders. He gives the example of Marjoe Gortner in God is Not Great.
Oh, man. The Marjoe story is just tragic. This kid whose parents basically tortured him into becoming a child evangelist in the Pentecostal church.
They trained him like an animal,
They
basically.
absolutely did. And he could do all the moves, the shouting, the fake healing, and the crowds just ate it up. They wanted to believe so badly that they completely ignored the fact that it was a performance.
So the leader enforces stricter rules to maintain power.
The people become more credulous and dependent, and the loop just gets tighter and tighter.
Then there's what you could call the attraction-repulsion loop. This gets into the deep psychology of the taboo.
Yes. Systems often fetishize the very thing they ban. Hitchens talks about the taboo around the pig in Judaism and Islam. He cites some anthropological theories suggesting that the pig wasn't originally seen as unclean.
It was the opposite.
It was originally revered or even sacred in some pre-monotheistic cultures, and only later did it become banned.
So there's this disordered sadomasochistic relationship, as he calls it, between the ruler and the ruled.
You simultaneously want and fear what you can't have. It keeps the subject emotionally and psychologically bound to the prohibitor. If I control what you eat, who you sleep with, and what you say, I am constantly in your head. I am the architect of your daily reality.
And the main tools of enforcement that hold all this together.
There are two main ones that he points to. First, and most obviously, is the argument from authority.
Which he calls the weakest of all arguments simply because I say so.
It's the weakest logical argument, yes, but it is the foundational tool of the entire system. It's the load-bearing wall.
And the second tool.
The solace bribe. This is the soft power. The system offers community, solidarity, a sense of purpose, uplift. Hitchens compares religion to an unctuous merchant in a bazaar.
He's selling you something that feels good.
He's offering you comfort, but the price is the suspension of your critical faculties.
Just check your brain at the door and we'll make you feel safe and part of something bigger than yourself.
Precisely. It's a transaction. You give me your intellectual freedom, and in return, I give you the warm, comforting feeling that you are part of a grand plan.
Let's pivot now and talk about the present-day implications. I mean, Hitchens wrote a lot of this stuff maybe 20 years ago, but it feels incredibly, sometimes uncomfortably relevant.
It really does.
He has this observation about the United States, calling it a banana republic with nukes.
Yeah, this is a fantastic inversion of the trope that you find in his later essays.
Yeah.
Usually when we think of a banana republic, we think of, a corrupt government and a thuggish, unprofessional army.
Right. The generalissimo in sunglasses, the crumbling infrastructure, soldiers stealing chickens from the market. That's the stereotype.
But Hitchens argued that in the U.S. context, particularly during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that he was covering, the situation was the exact reverse. He saw a remarkably competent professional military.
People who, by and large, did their jobs, followed codes of conduct, showed a certain kind of integrity.
Yes. But he saw a political class that was behaving like a corrupt, dysfunctional oligarchy.
So the competence was in the tools, the military, the technology. But the corruption or incompetence was in the leadership, in the political mind of the state.
Exactly. It's a systemic disconnect that I think we still see all the time. The machinery of the state can function perfectly well, but the brain guiding it is completely dysfunctional. It shows how institutions can rot from the head down, while the body is still trying to go through the motions.
Then there's the whole idea of the decline of secularism as a kind of neutral ground. He uses this metaphor of the one house.
It ought to be possible for me to pursue my studies in one house, and for the Buddhist to spin his wheel in another. That's the ideal of the secular commons he's describing.
A space where different beliefs can coexist because there's a shared, neutral public square.
But the system of faith, as he describes it, is rarely happy just staying in its room.
It's inherently expansionist.
That's the conflict. The system of faith constantly seeks to expand into the secular house, into public education, into science, into law. And Hitchens argues that when we lose that secular commons, we lose the very idea of a neutral ground.
And if everything becomes religious or ideological, then there is no neutral language left to resolve disputes.
Correct. If your argument starts from your scripture, and my argument starts from my scripture, and our scriptures fundamentally disagree, there is no court of appeal. There's no adjudication. There is only conflict.
Secularism, in this view, provides that neutral court where we can at least try to speak the common language of reason and evidence.
And without that, you just have warring tribes shouting past each other.
He also has a really nuanced take on Orientalism and his critique of the academic Edward Said. This is a bit complex, so can you walk us through it?
Sure. So Edward Said, in his famous book Orientalism, argued that the West basically invented a construct called the Orient to justify its empires.
Right. The East was portrayed as mysterious, dangerous, exotic, backward, and therefore needing to be ruled by the more rational West.
And Hitchens agrees with that basic premise, to an extent. He sees that empire absolutely created these self-serving constructs. But arguably, he critiques the critique. He warns against what he calls reverse Orientalism.
What's reverse Orientalism?
That's when, in an effort to be anti-imperialist, you fall into the opposite trap. You start ignoring the variegated nature of other cultures. You treat the Muslim world or the East as a single, uniform monolith that is purely a victim of the West.
So you end up ignoring their own internal politics, their own local oppressors, their own incredible diversity.
Exactly. You become blind to the vagary and variety of actual human beings because you're too focused on this big, abstract clash of systems, the West versus the East.
It's another way that systems can blind our perception.
It is. Hitchens had actually traveled to these places. He'd met the Kurds fighting Saddam. He'd met the Iraqi communists. He'd met the democratic dissidents in Iran. He knew they weren't just a monolithic bloc called the Orient. They were people fighting their own local fascists and theocrats.
So treating them only as victims of the West is actually a way of stripping them of their own agency.
It's a form of condescension, he would argue. It's saying, you are defined only by your relationship to us, the West. Hitchens demanded that we see the system of oppression wherever it lived, even if it was homegrown.
This brings us right back to the core theme of our channel, crisis in perception. How does all this work from Hitchens help us understand this crisis on a deeper level?
Well, I think one of the most powerful insights is that constant push to shift from individual blame to a systems analysis. There's this amazing quote Hitchens uses from The Silence of the Lambs, of all places.
The moth chrysalis scene with the entomologists.
That's the one. One of the scientists looks at the bug that the killer leaves in his victims' throats, and he says, somebody grew this guy. Fed him honey and nightshade, kept him warm.
And Hitchens applies that same logic to dictators.
He applies it to Hitler. He says, look, on his own, Hitler was a loser. He was a drifter, a failed artist. But somebody grew this guy. The system of belief in Germany at the time, the system of national humiliation after World War I, the deeply embedded system of anti-Semitism, it created the soil, the incubator, that allowed him to flourish.
So we can't just look at the bad man and say he was evil. We have to look at the soil that grew him.
And that is deeply uncomfortable for a lot of people. Hitchens notes this all the time, that people get angry when you suggest structural reasons for things like terrorism or war.
They want a simple good versus evil narrative.
Yes, they don't want cause and effect.
Because cause and effect might imply that we, on some level, participated in the cause.
And it implies that simply killing the bad man won't solve the underlying problem if the factory that grew him is still open for business. If you don't dismantle the system, the ideology, the incentives, the feedback loops, you will just grow another one. It's inevitable.
And our perception is also manufactured, he argues, by what we are allowed to say.
This goes right back to the Danish cartoons. When a word like respect becomes a code word for censorship, our perception of reality is literally narrowed by fear. We stop seeing things clearly because we're afraid to name them.
We engage in that preemptive surrender you mentioned.
We do. We censor ourselves before the state or the mob has to.
So after mapping out this entire totalitarian system, what is the antidote? What's the counter system that he proposes?
He has this wonderful concept he calls the Protestant atheist.
Protestant atheist. That sounds like a complete contradiction in terms.
It does on the surface. But he's using Protestant in a purely systemic sense. What was the core principle of the Protestant Reformation?
It was about the individual asserting the right to read the text for themselves. No priest, no intermediary filtering the truth.
Precisely. So you don't have to believe in God to be a Protestant in this sense. You just have to believe in your absolute right to read the world directly for yourself.
So it's the rejection of any special caste of decoders who claim to have a monopoly on the truth.
It is the assertion of the individual mind against the collective dogma. It's about taking radical responsibility for your own perception. You have to be the one to interpret the data, not anyone else.
And the other essential tool in this counter system is irony.
Well, that's vital. Totalitarian systems have no sense of humor. I mean, have you ever seen a genuinely funny dictator?
Not intentionally, no.
They can't tolerate it because irony depends on ambiguity. It depends on being able to hold two contradictory ideas in your head at the same time and see the gap between them. Totalitarianism cannot abide gaps. It demands seamless, absolute certainty.
So the crisis in perception is often really a crisis of certainty. People crave it so much they will literally surrender their freedom to get it.
And so the only real defense is to learn how to live with uncertainty.
To accept that the argument is never finished, which is probably the hardest thing for the human mind to do, to keep the file open, to constantly be willing to say, I might be wrong, or this is more complex than it looks.
And that leads to the wager Hitchens ends with, which is his answer to Pascal's famous wager.
Right. Pascal said you should bet on God existing because if you're right, you win everything, and if you're wrong, you lose nothing.
But Hitchens flips it. He asks a different question. If there is a God, who would he prefer? The person who honestly doubts based on the evidence he was given by that same God? Or the person who grovels and pretends to believe simply out of fear and self-interest?
The system prefers the groveler, the hypocrite.
Of course it does. But the free mind, and, he suggests, perhaps a truly moral God, would have to prefer the honest skeptic, because at least the skeptic is honest.
And that seems like a good place to bring this deep dive to a close. We've looked at the machinery of the celestial North Korea, the insidious trap of impossible laws, and the liberating, if difficult, power of the ironic mind.
I think the takeaway isn't that you have to think exactly like Christopher Hitchens. The takeaway is to use this lens to look at the systems in your own life, your bosses, your political parties, your social groups, and ask that fundamental question. Are they asking for my respect, or are they demanding my submission?
A huge thank you to the work of Christopher Hitchens. The primary sources for today's discussion were Long Live Hitch, God is Not Great, Hitch 22, and selections from Arguably. We highly encourage you to pick these up, read them, and argue with them. Borrow them from a library if you can.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis and Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.
Until next time, keep the argument open.